This video is brought to you by Brilliant. More about them in a bit.
Utilitarianism is one of the most popular moral theories to date. You'll find utilitarians all over the internet.
There's going to be something called rule utilitarianism, okay, which is like a little branch of consequentialism. So this is a fancy way of saying what I would want to do is I want to craft a set of rules for society, okay, that I believe maximizes the happiness of every single individual.
I'm a utilitarian, right? That's my ethical framework. So I think that, things are good or bad based on their consequences. That applies to both act and rule.
My ethical system is a form of utilitarianism. The actions we ought do are primarily the ones that maximize the degree to which people's brains are modeling reality as it exists independently of human minds.
But is it really a good theory? I'm going to argue it is not. But before I explain what is wrong with utilitarianism, let me explain what utilitarianism is. Utilitarianism is a theory that can see its origins from the thinker Jeremy Bentham in his work An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Jeremy Bentham constructs a theory in which we must act in regards to that which produces the most utility. In other words, a theory which sees right action as doing the greatest good for the greatest number. A theory which is focused on the acquisition of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. This is a hedonistic theory, a theory which is based upon pleasure and pain as being the overall goal of morality. This is something which is characteristic of utilitarianism, but not all utilitarians are hedonists, but all utilitarians are consequentialists. So let's delve into the theory and see if it really holds up to scrutiny.
But before we get into the nitty-gritty, here's a word from our sponsor, Brilliant.org. Brilliant.org is a new way for busy people to learn with bite-sized lessons and break down important concepts into understandable chunks. Brilliant has thousands of lessons from foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, and neural networks. Brilliant is one of the best ways to learn maths and computer science interactively. Brilliant gives you the opportunity to gradually master whole topics in as little as 15 minutes a day, anytime, anywhere on your phone, tablet, or computer, and is designed for high-velocity learning with guided learning paths to help you stay focused and reach your goals as fast as possible. My favorite lessons are the ones on logic. The lessons on logic are really valuable because they help hone your critical thinking skills and make you a better logician and so a better philosopher. What I like most about these lessons is that they give you the opportunity to learn from your mistakes and see where your reasoning is going wrong so that you can correct it in the future. So if you want to try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/perspective philosophy, and the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Now, back to the video.
Let's begin with the principle of utility. What is the greatest good for the greatest number? Well, Jeremy Bentham relied on a kind of psychological egoism which he got from Hume and Hobbes, that we desire what we want and that what we want is what is good, the kind of Hobbesian consideration of freedom, and the Humean notion of the passions, this idea of social utility, which led him to a hedonistic position which saw that we are ruled by two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. And so everything done in our lives is governed by pain and pleasure. However, why must this be the case? And what is pleasure and pain? And what is happiness? If we take any of these concepts abstractly, what do they mean? They often fall apart, which is the first issue with utilitarianism. What is pleasurable and what is painful seems to differ depending upon the individual that is being referenced. And so when we are talking about the universality of pleasures and pains, how do we sum universally other people's pleasure and other people's pain in such a way as to make it a calculation? How do I understand whether my pain is the same as your pain and whether your pain is the same as my pain? And even if there are differences, how do we qualify those differences? What metric do we use in order to say that my pain is a 5 while your pain is a 7 while somebody else's pain is an 11? So the first issue is an incommensurability between agents in summing concepts of happiness and pain, because these concepts are being personally defined by a hedonistic agent who is appropriating these concepts in mere reference to their past experiences from this account. So there is no reason to believe from this position that our experiences of pain and pleasure can be summed at all. The next point leads nicely on from this. Why should I care about other people? If I'm coming from a position in which I'm arguing for my pleasure or the avoidance of pain, why should I care about other people's pleasure and pain? Why should I engage in the universality of pleasure and pain? Why should I engage in these abstract concepts? This is another issue that utilitarianism does not deal with. What is it that is good about universal pleasure that is not good about my particular pleasure? Why should I not consider my particular pleasures over the universality of pleasure? So the question is, why should I engage in a utilitarian calculation at all if that calculation might undermine my egoistic good? And if the grounding is egoistic in the case of Bentham, or if it's hedonistic in the same case as Mill, what about these pleasures is going to make me associate with a universal pleasure? The only reason that can be given is that I desire the universality of pleasure, which means that I have to already be committed to other people having value in the first place. So it already assumes its own correctness in its application. We can see something similar occurring in J.S. Mill's work as in Bentham's, in which it's hedonistic, but he ends up having to differentiate two kinds of pleasures, higher pleasures and lower pleasures. There's those pleasures which are better than other pleasures, but how am I supposed to know this? How can I even mediate between my own pleasures given this normative ethic? This leads us on to the third point, quality versus quantity. How do I reference a certain quality of pleasure versus a quantity of pleasure? And can they be made commensurable? It seems to be clear that certain pleasures are not qualitatively comparable to other pleasures, that I have no reason to assume that a quality of one pleasure equals to a quantity of another pleasure. Why should I say that 5 apples worth of pleasure would equate to 1 bar of chocolate? I have no way of making that reference. There's a qualitative distinction there. Or even more abstractly, how do we equate the value of something like poetry to something like alcohol? How do I equate the pleasure of being inebriated and having a great drunken good time to the beauty and majesty that I can find in poetry in such a way that I can then equate and sum up how many drinks I need to have to make up a poem, or how much poetry I would need to read or in order to make up for being left at home by my friends? A utilitarian calculation can't give us that. We instead are forced again to appeal to an intuition. Which is better or worse? Mill says that we will simply know this by experiencing these higher pleasures. But there seems to be an issue here, as he says that it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than the fool satisfied. How could a Socrates know what it's like to be a fool satisfied if he is a Socrates? He's never had that experience. How could it account for something like blissful ignorance or innocence even? There seems to be an issue here in which it is simply asserted that one pleasure can be known to be better than another through mere intuition, even though there stands no real point of reference, which is what it's like to experience those pleasures in isolation from each other in the first place. So, how do we resolve this? It doesn't seem like it can be resolved within utilitarianism. What's more is, how do I work out how much higher pleasure is worth lower pleasure in relation to other individuals? Is it better to put resources into education, for example, rather than, let's say, improving quality of living standards because of the higher pleasures that other people would obtain if they simply understood the good of Wordsworth? This relates nicely to another issue between the quality and quantity distinction, which was raised by Aristotle in the Politics. Why are we assuming that numeric equality is the only kind of equality at play? Even if I assume that everyone is equal to 1, even if I assume that I have reason to believe in other people's interests, whose interests do I care about? Look at it like this. The philosopher carrot that if a moral situation was to arise in which an innocent man must be hung for a crime he did not commit, but it would stop civil unrest, a utilitarian would have to accept that this was a good scenario because the civil unrest might cause worse consequences than the hanging of this one innocent man. But why are we only considering this from a numeric equality? It seems that the equality at play here is simply assuming everyone to be equal to one, when Aristotle already argued that there are other forms of equality, which is, for example, proportional equality. Are we considering everyone's identity equally? And this leads on to another point. Is numeric equality enough? Another example of this could be slavery. If the majority racial group were to enslave a racial minority, it may bring more pleasure to that majority group than pain suffered by that minority group if done in such a way as to not outright kill them, harm them, but simply to exploit them as much as possible whilst maintaining a medium living standard. Would this be acceptable? A utilitarian might be forced to say, yes, this is acceptable because hedonistically it brings the greatest outcome, because it brings and produces the most happiness. And so we have an issue in which proportional equality is not being respected. Individuals seem to have no real value. Instead, abstract experiences have value, which only raises a further point in saying if we increase the numbers of individuals within society and happiness is to drop, but disproportionately to the increase of individuals being born, is that a good thing to do? So in other words, should we have as many people as possible live a life which is just worth living, rather than having a smaller group of people living a life which is far more qualitatively greater, because we can produce greater amounts of overall happiness if we sum this up? So this comes to the point of, are we even treating an individual as an equal who is worth one when we are treating them as a numeric unit, as a digit, as a monad? Because if that's the case, if they are losing their individuality through their identity loss, because they are being enslaved, because they are being undermined in some other way, are they really being treated as an equal, as a one? And so it seems to show that numeric equality by itself seems to undermine itself, and so requires proportional equality. This leads me to what I think is the foundational problem of utilitarianism, which really can be understood in relation to the birth of the modern self. That which maybe was birthed from the Protestant Reformation, found its way through the Enlightenment, and has become the archetypical form of the modern Western man, which is hyper-individualism. Utilitarianism relies upon this numerical equality. Everyone equals one. However, everyone is a unit, a digit, a monad, a single isolated individual whose psychology is intimately known by themselves necessarily, intuitionally, which leads to a far greater problem. How can I know myself if I am an isolated particular? What grounds can I use for knowledge if I do not have a universal basis to order and understand my life? What concepts can apply to me if my existence seems to be an accident? This is a problem with psychological egoism. It's a problem with the liberal conception of the self, and it's a problem with utilitarianism. How am I supposed to understand myself if I can't reference another individual's desire? You see, it seems to be quite evident that the concepts we use to analyze ourselves in psychoanalysis and even through mere introspection are communal in origin. They are universals. They apply to all of us. For example, we all say the word I, meaning our individuated identities. But this I is universal. It applies to every one of us. If I say I and you say I, we both mean the same thing from a different position, which means that we are either talking about radically different concepts and just giving it a nominal signifier, which means absolutely nothing, or they share the same conceptual framework, meaning we share the same conceptual framework. And so if these concepts must necessarily apply to our particular individual experiences, then our identities can never be understood through mere numeric equality, which means that the lack of proportional equality means that we will necessarily lose our identities. In other words, I will lose what is good for me, what I think is pleasurable, what I actually want and desire, what brings me happiness, because I won't have the concepts which are socially formed through a process of psychological mediation in which I associate with you and you associate with me in concepts such as humanity, in concepts such as culture, in concepts such as community. And without these communal conceptual structures, how ought I understand myself in relation to what is actually good for me? And moreover, if this is the source of my individual conceptions of happiness, then why am I looking towards my own pleasures and my own pains and my own goods and bads in relation to a concept which is simply summing me up as an individual in the first place, when I should simply look towards the community and the concepts we are creating together? There seems to be a disparity here. I'm assuming what is good for everyone is hyper-individualistic, but what is good for everyone seems to be communal in origin. It seems to be universal. And this leads on to the final criticism, which is, how do we gain these communal structures in the first place? How do I gain these structures of value? Let's just assume that the utilitarian acclimates this and assumes that there is this universal nature, but then says, but yes, and I can know this individually in myself. How do they know it? Where is this structure being generated from? The only answer they can give is in the process of mutual recognition in producing a language, in which case it is preceding the consequences. I have already acted in accordance with what I believe is good, or a process which I believe will lead to a good life communally, in order to ethically construct the very concepts that I will then use to introspect, reflect, and then re-engage in the community. Which means that the practices and the institutions of our lives are actually the foundations of the goods that we will then reference, which means that it cannot be a consequentialist theory, because the consequences, pleasure, pain, good and bad, are all supervened upon the accomplishment or the achievement of a certain goal, of a practice. And so that goal from which we are referencing precedes pleasure. And so moral value cannot be reduced to pain and pleasure alone, because it relies upon another consideration of value to come into being. So I'd also like to announce the spring sale for my course, An Introduction to Western Philosophy. You can get 30% off a course which will take you right from the classics all the way through to the contemporaries in metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics. So check that out if you're interested. Like, subscribe, and as always, try to gain some perspective.